Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another Ask an OpenShift Admin Office Hours. I am Chris Short, executive producer of OpenShift TV. I am joined by the one and only Andrew Sullivan. What do we want to call you? Like Vert OpenShift star to the gods? What?
That difficult guy.
Yeah.
You know that.
That guy that says, this is documented. Just do it like that.
Where's Christian? Christian calls me the cuddly curmudgeon.
Right. The cuddly curmudgeon. Exactly. Right. Like very approachable, but like don't ask him dumb questions. But on this show, there's no such thing as dumb questions. So
no, it's I think Christian calls me a curmudgeon because I tend to be very conservative in my approach to things. And that's admittedly a learned behavior, right? I was an administrator for a long time. So the first big boy job, if you will, that I had was as an administrator for a production Vsphere environment. And our storage admin decided one day that, nope, I'm done with this. I don't want to do this anymore. So I was also the storage admin and, learned the hard way, learned through trial and error, things like, don't accidentally delete the NFS data store from underneath, Vsphere. That's bad.
That could end up destructive, potentially. Yeah.
Don't trust the network guys when they say, oh, we'll just reboot the router. It won't affect anything because no, all of that IP-based storage you're using is traversing the router. And
oh God.
So, it's one of those learned behaviors of trust but verify, right?
Right. Like you just reminded me of a story about a reboot the router story where I had to like literally stop somebody's hand from touching the power switch before, right? Like, no, don't do that.
So it's and my favorite one was I was working with the government and we had a junior enlisted person who was responsible for vacuuming the data center. And they were traversing through doors and the vacuum hose caught the lid for the EPO, right? The emergency power off button. And of course, when the lid lifts up, it sets off an alarm.
Right.
And the immediate reaction was, well, if I mash this button, the alarm will stop, which was true. It stopped the alarm along with the rest of the data center. Wow. That was a fun evening.
Just wow.
Yeah. So anyways, cuddly curmudgeon, it's less about, asking questions or I try to never take the approach of, you should already know this, right? Why don't you know this? Or anything like that, because what's that XKCD? Let me dig up the XKCD.
Well, it's not, it's the, I use Julia Evans, like, don't feign surprise, right? Like treat it as an opportunity to learn. I don't have it printed out, but I'm pretty sure it's still hanging up in my basement, my basement office. That is kind of a construction zone right now, but it's, treat it as an opportunity to teach somebody new and exciting to them, not, like, oh, why don't you know this already, right? Like, go read the man page. No, we don't want people like that in the industry, right? Like, we want people that are enthusiastic about teaching.
Yeah. And it's one of those, like, when I was an administrator, when I eventually became an architect and all that other stuff, and it became one of those, the more you know, the less you have to ask me. Like, I don't want to be a single point of failure. I got other stuff to do. I don't need to do your job and my job. So it very much becomes one of those education, teaching, helping, right? Bringing everybody along and up. And that's one of the things I love about Red Hat, right? Red Hat has that culture just ingrained inside of Red Hat of, I've never sent an email and, asking what is potentially a dumb question and gotten a response other than absolutely. Let me show you how that works.
Right.
JP Dade.
I was just about to say.
Yeah. I haven't seen an update recently. As far as I know, they are still blocked. Let's check and see. Here, I'll share my screen.
Sure. Let me get the link real quick to what are you sharing? The Cincinnati graph?
Yes. So github.com/OpenShift. And if we go to Cincinnati, I can never remember how to spell Cincinnati. I just remember the CIN.
I only know it because my daughter went to school there now.
If we go to blocked edges and we check way down here on 4.74, it's still got blocked here with a link out to the same BZ that we talked about last week. Which is
this is only impacting Vsphere?
Yeah, so this is one of those releases are done holistically across all platforms.
Mhm.
So there isn't an upgrade or there isn't it's not, I can't target a release that says you can upgrade all platforms except Vsphere. It's either all
Right.
or none in that case.
Yeah.
So in this instance, yes, all upgrades from or to OpenShift 4.7 are blocked as a result of a bug that we found in Vsphere. So for those customers who aren't using Vsphere, right? Yeah, yes, I know, and even for those who are using Vsphere, right? It's frustrating. You know, we're 2 months past now.
We feel your pain. Trust me.
Yeah, trust me. We feel it both on a personal level of I'm constantly trying to deploy and troubleshoot and work with these things and you know help you all, our audience, our customers, you know, with these problems. So I feel it, as well as I know there's a lot of pressure, you know, coming into, you know, Red Hat, into our organization around figuring and fixing that. So keep an eye on this BZ. I'll post the link to the BZ and
I got it already
here. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
But yeah, unfortunately, yeah, they're still blocked, and I know that they are working diligently to get that figured out. And again, I see those emails between, you know, our team and the VMware team, and there's kernel developers involved and all kinds of other stuff.
There's a lot going on behind the scenes. Absolutely.
I know we got a little distracted there with storytelling, but just to reiterate, or just to remind everybody, this is the OpenShift Administrator Office Hour. Or excuse me, this is the Ask an OpenShift Admin Office Hour. Man, I reverted back to the,
wow,
the original title.
We've had this title for how long now?
Well, I was doing work yesterday to go, you know, to document and retitle the original episode.
Making
so
the list for me. Yeah, sorry about that.
So what that means is that our goal here, our purpose, the reason why we have the stream is for you to ask us questions. Doesn't matter what it's about. Doesn't matter, you know, whether or not it's something that we can help with. And what I mean by that is, if we don't know the answer, we'll find the answer.
Right.
You know,
and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things, as I was just saying, is just finding the right people inside of Red Hat and getting those answers. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we had Mark Curry on with the, we were talking about Multis and CNI and all that other stuff. And, you know, Doug and Tommy,
yes,
both in engineering on, you know, and working in Multis, I have learned so much from them, and seeing the email chains that have been generated out of that. So you all, our audience, there was a couple of people who sent me emails and basically said, hey, how does this work? Or how can I do this? And I've, you know, connected the dots there, or connected the people there. And I've already learned just a tremendous amount about how all of that stuff works. So to me, it's really exciting to see all that stuff.
Nice.
So yeah, at any point in time, please feel free, ask questions, whatever it is that is at the top of your mind, something that's bothering you, some problem or issue that you're having, you know, architecture questions, functionality questions, all that stuff. Please, 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 please don't hesitate to ask those questions.
Yeah, we encourage it.
And if for whatever reason we can't get to your question, we can't answer it here on the stream, I always follow up each one of our episodes with a blog post. So if we switch over to this tab here, this is the blog post from last week. I'll post that into the chat here. And you can see that we essentially do a synopsis. So coming down here, remember last week I said, hey, you know, we don't have enough time to cover all of these items, all of these different parts and components, but I'll provide links to all of those inside of the blog post. Well, here's the pudding, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you can absolutely find all of that. We try to get those published every Friday. So far, we've been pretty consistent with that. So check openshift.com/blog on Friday mornings usually, and you can see this week's blog post, including links to, if we come all the way down here to the bottom, you can see we have links directly to in the stream where we answer those questions, right? So any questions that you happen to bring up. Awesome. So with that being said, or I guess the next part, or the next thing that we tend to do here, and I'm sorry I keep looking over this way, that your little window was way over here, so when I
Sorry.
go to look at you, I'm actually looking over there. So
remember, I'm the camera. Look at the camera.
Yeah, that's what I do. I put
Look
it right
at
below
me.
the camera.
Look at me.
So
I'm the producer now.
Not just now, just always. So one of the things I like to do here is talk about the things that have come to my attention, the things that are top of mind for me that I think are important or relevant for you all. So this week, there's a couple of things that I want to bring up in that respect. So first, I've had quite a few conversations over the last 6 or 8 or 9 months around the load balancer that's used with IPI. So if you're not familiar with this, effectively with on-premises IPI deployments, so Vsphere, Red Hat Virtualization, OpenStack, and bare metal IPI, we deploy a built-in load balancer. So what that means is when you go through the installation process, right, it asks you for things like what is the app's virtual IP address, so star.apps, the ingress IP address, and what is the API, so the api.clustername.domain IP address. And those two IP addresses are managed by KeepAliveD. So KeepAliveD puts that IP address onto an eligible host. DNS directs all of that traffic onto the host, and you get your fully functional cluster. So the problem with that is, particularly for the apps, for the star.apps ingress point, it's limited to a single node in the cluster, right? It's one IP address. That IP address is hosted on a node that has a router instance, right? The HA proxy OpenShift router instance. And it doesn't do any real load balancing behind the scenes. So if you have, if you scale your router instances from 2 to 3 to 5 to 12 or however many you have, all of that traffic still goes into one. Those additional instances are just there for high availability or failover capability. So the question is, can I use an external load balancer with on-prem IPI? And the answer here, there's really kind of three answers or three possibilities that you have here. So the first one is more or less to replace the ingress load balancer. So what do I mean by that? You could, for example, and let me see if I have the KCS handy here. Let's see. I have to search in one window where I'm actually logged in. And
yeah, I feel that.
Yeah. Here we go. Well, I said that, and now I clicked the wrong thing. Anyway, so for example, usually the example I use here is F5. So the F5 folks have a certified operator. So if I go to catalog.redhat.com and I come up here and look for OpenShift operators, and I search for F5, we get back this F5 controller for OpenShift and Kubernetes. So if you were to use this operator, and they aren't the only ones, Citrix has one, Cisco ACI has one, right? There's a number of those. Effectively, what it does is it deploys the F5 ingress controller. So instead of using the default Red Hat OpenShift provided ingress controller that is based off of HA proxy, instead you use the F5 ingress controller, which coordinates with an external F5 appliance. Same thing for Citrix and their ADC controller, so on and so forth. So that's one option, right? Just don't use the default one, right? Instead, use the one, use a different ingress controller with your cluster. And then you can absolutely take advantage of kind of whatever, whichever of the load balancers you want to.
Right.
So the other option, and this is something that, as far as I know, is only documented by OpenStack. So let's go to docs. There we go. So if I go to the documentation and scroll down to networking and scroll down to load balancing on OpenStack, they have this configuring an external load balancer section. And I'll copy and paste this into the chat. And effectively what this is documenting is for on-prem IPI with OpenStack, here's how you can configure an external load balancer and then effectively swing that ingress and API endpoints over to that.
Mhm.
So unfortunately, this isn't tested or documented with any of the other deployment methods. So therefore, we can't authoritatively say, yes, it will work, and therefore it falls into kind of a support gray area. So I haven't been able to get an answer out of the support folks as to, well, yes, it's documented for OpenStack, but does that mean it's also supported with Vsphere, for example, even though
Right.
the infrastructure isn't really material in that instance?
Hmm.
So just FYI, this is here if you happen to be using OpenStack and you want to migrate off of that default built-in load balancer and you're not using the Courier or the Octavia integration. This is one option that you have available.
Hmm.
So the third option is kind of effectively replacing that, but using something, unofficial. And that could be as simple as, following the documentation here. And basically, I'm not going to talk about it because it's definitely not supported, and I don't want to encourage that at all. So really, the two options are use a different ingress controller, or use an external load balancer following this OpenStack configuration here. So there is some stuff going on here, behind the scenes around how can we make this better? How can we configure this? How can we make it more configurable? So just keep an eye out. I do have somewhere in my multitude of tabs, I do have an RFE that I can dig up for this. So that way we can um, take it, or that way we can track that progress. And if it's something any of our audience, right, if you raise that with your account team, let them know they can just reach out to me, and then we can kind of associate account information with that, which helps product management with prioritization. Basically, they use your input as customers as a huge contributor to what's important and what should be prioritized from an engineering perspective. So
JP Data asks, can't you spread the ingress controller over a set of infra nodes? Right. So it's not.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So with UPI, absolutely, or even the non-integrated install, right? I can, it can be infra nodes, it can be router nodes. You can tag them whatever you want, but essentially you can scale that ingress controller to 2, 5, 8, 10, however many instances. And normally with with UPI or a non-integrated install, you have an external load balancer that is pointed at each one of your nodes that's eligible or that's hosting a router instance, right? A HA proxy ingress instance. So incoming traffic comes in, it hits that external load balancer. The external load balancer looks at all of the nodes that it has available to it. So all the ones that are running that HA proxy ingress controller instance, and then it routes that external session over to one of those. And assuming, and I think the documentation by default says configure all worker nodes inside of that external load balancer. So if I have 12 ingress instances, 12 ingress HA proxy instances, then it would be load balanced across all 12. The problem with IPI, on-prem IPI, is that external load balancer basically doesn't exist. So it's just a single virtual IP address, right? The star.apps, the one associated with the star.apps DNS name. And it just moves from node to node, with and only on nodes that have an HA proxy ingress instance on it. So it would be the same effect as if you had an external load balancer that only had one node configured on the back end.
Yeah. Right. Not so smart. Yeah. But anyways, I'm sorry, meaning multiple. You don't want a single point of failure. Spread it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Keep Alive D solution, right? The on-prem IPI solution does that, right? Keep Alive D maintains that virtual IP address. So if the node that's hosting it goes down for any reason, it moves to a different node. So you only have a slight blip. Anecdotally, what I hear is somewhere between 1 and 5 seconds. So you have a slight blip in that ingress traffic as the IP moves, and then a reverse ARP goes out to let the infrastructure know that it moved, and then things return to normal. So yeah, that's where we stand today. If you have any questions about that, if it's something that is an issue for you, just let me know, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com, and then we can kind of work through that and look at what those different options are, as well as work with product management and engineering.
Nice.
So yeah. Yeah, you're gonna love this one. DHCP reservations.
Okay.
DHCP, it's a reoccurring theme. I think we have talked about DHCP in more episodes than we haven't talked about DHCP.
That's probably accurate. Yeah.
So a reoccurring question that we get is, if you look in the documentation, and I'll see if I can find it here real quick. So let's go to installing. I'll pick on Vsphere this time, and we'll just go with this. We'll go with this one, installing a cluster. So if I do a quick search for DHCP and reservation, no, somewhere in here, we more or less tell you, yes, with IPI, DHCP is required. But
network requirements.
Yeah. So we tell you, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, the documentation says DHCP is required for IPI because it is, right? We require you to, the nodes to be able to dynamically get their IP addresses. But then we also say static DHCP reservations are encouraged for worker nodes and should be used for control plane nodes. So the rationale here is, and if I come back over here, let me see if I can search the KCS this time. Let's just go here. Well, thank you. That was not what I wanted. Come on. So if I search for OpenShift DHCP reservation, I should have had this link prepared, right?
Probably.
Here we go. So let me post this link in here. And effectively what this says is, I guess I could log in. So effectively what this is going to say is that when you use DHCP, you want to make sure that your particularly control nodes always get the same IP address.
Very important.
Yeah. And so what we've seen is, somebody will shut off a cluster and it'll be down for, an hour, a day, a week, whatever, turn it back on, and the nodes get a different DHCP address. This can particularly be an issue if you have a short lease time or if your DHCP pool is very busy, right? Basically, the node goes down, right? Basically, it does a release, and then something else immediately is requesting an IP address, and there's so few available that it immediately starts reusing the ones that are there, right? That type of stuff. So we make this recommendation of use static, DHCP leases, DHCP reservations for your control plane nodes. The rationale being, if the control plane node IPs change, etcd can't reform itself, right? And if etcd can't come up, then the rest of the cluster can't come up. Normally, if only one node at a time changes, the etcd operator, cluster etcd operator, will be able to recover. But if all three change, then it can't reach its own quorum, and that's bad. So for that reason, we encourage you to use DHCP reservations. The question is, but it's IPI. I don't know the MAC addresses beforehand. The installer creates the control plane nodes and Machine API creates worker nodes. So how can I create those? And the answer is both simple and frustrating. And that is more or less, after provisioning, use the tools of your DHCP server to convert it to a reservation. I have reached out to some VMware peers. I've reached out to some others and to figure out things like, VMware has this concept of a MAC address pool. Can I create a pool of known addresses and then associate that with my OpenShift VMs so that they only, whenever it provisions a new node, it only comes from this pool and stuff like that. More or less what I got told is, well, it doesn't work that way. So I'm hoping we can make this easier in the future, but honestly, I don't have any, and I have not seen any information with that regard. So just FYI, when you see that we suggest and encourage DHCP reservations, especially for control plane nodes, you just have to do that day 2, right? So after the node is deployed, change that over to a DHCP reservation. I will note that if you are deploying physical IPI, bare metal IPI, and your DHCP lease time is set to infinite, then it will automatically convert. It will automatically apply a bit of automation and convert that to a static IP assignment or a static IP configuration on the physical node only. So remember, this is bare metal physical IPI, not the other installation methods. Let's see.
Suresh has a question if you have a second.
Yep.
And Suresh, we're going to probably need some more details about your configuration specifically, but is it mandatory to have DNS records of Kate's nodes and external DNS server? No, it's not mandatory, but it depends on how you set things up too. Like,
yeah,
are you exposing the control plane to the public?
Yeah. So with IPI, no. With IPI, it will deploy an MDNS instance, and all of the nodes will register themselves with MDNS. So it will do internal resolution. So effectively, control plane nodes can find worker nodes and vice versa. The only time that would be an issue is if you want to connect directly to a node. So if you're trying to, for example, SSH from your workstation into, worker17.clustername.domain name, that DNS name wouldn't be externally visible unless you're doing like a DHCP dynamic DNS update, right? In which case it would be visible. With UPI, I don't believe they're required.
No, I don't think they are either.
In my mind, it brings into question whether so host names are set a couple of different ways, and the most prominent and the way that will take precedence is reverse lookups. So if there is no reverse entry, I don't know how it will react to that, because normally it would want to use the node name. Like if you do an OCGit node, right, it'll show the node name inside of there. If it can't look that up, if it doesn't understand how to talk to that, I don't know how that would work, if it would just return back an IP address or something like that. Honestly, it's not something I've tested, so I'm not sure. I know in the documentation, we say that, here, if we look at so this is IPI. Let's switch over to installing a cluster on Vsphere with user provision information or infrastructure. Words are hard. If we come down here to networking requirements, I believe it says that DNS, like we basically say DNS is required. And I know, here, user provision DNS requirements. So I know that we say that it is required here. So here, control plane nodes, worker nodes. And that's just to avoid, if nothing else, that is to avoid a lot of potential issues. So I would say follow the docs. They are required with UPI, with IPI. It's not on the docs. It'll take care of itself. Keep alive D is poor man's F5. I wouldn't even go that far.
I wouldn't even go that far.
It's just to keep the IP address accessible.
Right.
It doesn't do any kind of load balancing, any kind of, anything like that. So,
so the static IP question, I read somewhere, haven't tested, that if we offer a DHCP IP address with an infinite lease, Red Hat CoreOS will configure the IP address as a static IP address.
Yes, and that's what I was talking about with, it's only with bare metal IPI.
Right.
So we can see if we go to GitHub, oops, I type in the window here. So if I go back to OpenShift GitHub, and this time I want to go to the machine config operator. And I'm going to switch the branch here to, I'll go with release 4.7. And in here, we're looking for the templates directory. And then we go into, I think it's common. And then bare metal and files. Yeah. So we have this network manager static DHCP.yaml. And effectively what this is doing is exactly what we just described, right? It says, is this an infinite lease? If so, I'm going to apply the IP address as static. But you'll note it's only with bare metal, right? And specifically
Right.
bare metal IPI. So if you're using, any of the other IPIs on-prem, it doesn't take effect. If you're just doing a bare metal UPI or a non-integrated install, it doesn't take effect, right? It's only bare metal IPI.
Mm.
So yeah, you can see exactly where that logic lives and what triggers it inside of here. Because I think if we go up a window or up, one of these here is the one that basically says if it has the template for the if statement where it detects the installation type and installation method, infrastructure, installation infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
JPDAID on my UPI install, I had to configure DNS and DHCP. Yep, a whole lot of settings in DHCP to set hostname and NTP. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So the NTP, if your DHCP server is serving NTP, that's a nice, convenient way to get everything configured correctly. If not, we talked about this last week in the day 2 stuff of configuring. I don't know where it went inside of here, but somewhere inside of here is configuring Crony.
Yes.
Yeah. So the link directly to the documentation inside of here for configuring the time synchronization service using machine config in this instance.
Right. Timing is everything, folks, especially in Kubernetes, because Kubernetes makes great use of certificates, and certificates are very finicky about, is this valid, yes or no?
Yep.
Wait, why is this time offset different from this box and this box? It will pick stuff up like that, and you'll see some weird errors as a result.
So yeah, please keep the questions coming in. So don't hesitate. With great power comes more settings. Yes, that's
exactly.
Absolutely true. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is if you missed this blog post on OpenShift.com, August Simonelli, who is one of our peers from Down Under, he lives out in Australia. He released an update to this tested solution for OpenShift on OpenStack. So essentially, he went through. It's not a reference architecture, but it's a tested architecture, tested and validated architecture for deploying OpenShift on OpenStack. So. Great resource if you happen to be doing OpenShift on OpenStack. Be sure to check that out. I know he put a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears into that, and it's a hugely
same time.
beneficial, thing if you happen to be using that architecture.
So what is the rationale behind having this behavior, infinite lease to static IP, limited to bare metal IPI only? Why not for other setups too?
So I will say Andrew's, so Andrew's opinion is that, or my hope maybe is that we will expand that to other infrastructures as well. But I don't know that for certain. I would have to dig through the RFEs and see if we can find where that's documented at. Or
which one goes first kind of deal and everything else.
So, the logic with bare metal, with physical servers is pretty straightforward. One, it is the only time with an IPI where we're going to know the MAC addresses ahead of time.
There's that.
Because you can
Macs
physically look at it. It's not actually, creating machines on the fly. It's just configuring them on the fly. So I think that's one of the things that leads to it. I hope that we do add it for the others, simply because I know DHCP is a point of contention. And this is something that would actually be really interesting to me for anybody who's listening in. Why is DHCP so contentious, right? And we've heard this basically since IPI on-prem was a thing, which is what OpenShift 4.2 was when it was released with OpenStack. Hey, I can't do DHCP in my data center. Can I do IPI without DHCP? And a lot of times we get back this kind of hand wavy, well, the security team won't let us. And while I can make a lot of assumptions there, it would be interesting to know, like, what's the details there? What's going on behind the scenes? Why won't they let us do it, if you will?
And, in my experience, it has, and please, audience, why won't your people, run DHCP in the data center. Please tell us why. In my experience, it's because there is anything that's not using DHCP that you would then have to configure, and that anything could be of varying sizes between 4 to 400 instances of something, or entire ranges of IP classes like /16s and so off. So yeah. Maybe Cisco proprietary OS. Well, if you're using your switches and routers as gateways and DHCP servers and everything else, yeah, there's some limitations there potentially. Like hard to configure and limitations, I mean, right? Like not ubiquitous, right? Like I'm not going to let my Windows DNS admin jump into the Cisco router and start configuring DHCP. Yeah. There's a learning curve there, right? So
I know, when I was an administrator, our security team wouldn't let us do DHCP, and it was largely because their fear, particularly in the land of virtualization, was
right.
Anybody could stand up something, and we don't know what it is, and it'll just get an IP address. Kind of the old saying about well, anybody can walk through the data center and plug their laptop into a network port. Well, no, I mean technically yes, but that's why we have things like port security.
Right. So yeah, the JPD points out plugging in a foreign device into the data center is frowned on. DHCP is good for workstations only. To which Apostolos says it's old school network security thinking, to which I agree. It is kind of an old school methodology, right? Like DHCP has been around a really long time, and lots of people are using it in their data centers.
Yeah. I'll also, I think some of it comes from I'm going to use the term cloud native here, but
yeah,
kind of the current and even really the last generation of applications. When we think back to like the 2000s, 2010 and earlier, applications didn't change a lot, right? Especially when everything, before virtualization really took hold, servers were put into a rack, they were given a static IP address, and then all of the things that needed to connect to it would a lot of times just use the IP address.
Right.
They wouldn't use a DNS name.
Yeah. So because no one wants to muck with DNS because DNS is DNS.
Yeah. What happens if DNS goes down? What happens if, my database server is at, x.y.z.a, and, all of the applications that connect to that database connect on x.y.z.a. So yeah, that's an interesting one. I've been wondering that for a while as to why we don't see DHCP, more widespread in data centers. Cluster DHCP servers. Yes, that is something that's absolutely, if you are going to be using, DHCP in your data center, something like OpenShift, which are IPI, which requires DHCP, make sure it is an enterprise grade service. That was one of the things I learned from our field early on, is that a lot of customers, even if they have DHCP in the data center, it's running off of like one VM, and it's not treated with the same level of resiliency and availability that we see with other data center services. So yeah, JP Dade, very much to your point, make sure that it is treated and managed appropriately for the level of importance that it holds.
Yeah, and I can't say Kazern. I mean, I'm sorry if I butcher your screen name, my bad. But in my experience, most of the enterprise network admin setups don't like dynamic addressing because of conventional data centers. Everything for the VMs are predetermined with firewall rules and IPs and everything else. So yeah.
So I know we're just like last week, we're pretty far in at this point, and we've kind of brushed against several things that I wanted to talk about with regard to today's topic, which is, as the title suggests, day 2 operations. So effectively, hey, we just finished deploying our cluster. Now what? What else do I need to do to get ready to actually use that cluster? So last week, as you saw, if you look at these headings here, we talked about kind of node level or machine level operations that need to happen or could happen, cluster level operations, and then kind of some other things just to be aware of. Many of these could probably be lumped up into the cluster side of things. But so this week, I want to focus on network, storage, and kind of preparing for users. So network, This almost always comes down to how do I do, or how do I configure, or how do I manage the network configuration after deployment? And especially, and we're seeing this more and more now, for people who want to have a secondary or tertiary or however many interfaces for additional network traffic, or additional traffic types, I should say. The most common one by far is a isolated, non-routable storage network, right?
Mm-hmm.
I need to connect to NFS PVCs or iSCSI PVCs or whatever that happens to be, and the storage team has a dedicated, IP network specifically for that. Go back to my comment about routing and all of that other stuff, and we'll just reboot the router. It's fine. It's good.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's the best way to do that? And I will say that, and do I have it up here? Let's come up here to, I want networking, and we're going to, where is it? NM state. So I'll say that there's really there's three answers, of which one of them I don't consider to be a valid option. So the first one is you should configure those interfaces at install time. So with UPI or with a non-integrated installation, that means either passing IP equals configuration parameters. You're going to multiple IP equals. So maybe if your first interface, right? So I'm going to, ETH0 is the one that is used for SDN, right? It is the primary interface. Maybe it uses DHCP. Great. IP equals ETH0 colon DHCP.
Mm-hmm.
And then your secondary interface needs a static IP address. You can absolutely do that, and you can use the standards, right? A second IP equals, and then follow the normal nomenclature for doing that. So just to grab an example of that, I'll come down here to installing on any platform, do a quick search for IP equals. And we can see an example here, right? Basically exactly like this. So right here in the documentation, we can see we can just append as many of those as we have interfaces. And that includes things like creating bonds. So if we scroll down a little bit further here, so we have this bond equals, and then we can create bond 0 that has two interfaces. We provide the bonding mode, and then I can then assign an IP address to that bond. We do the same thing with VLANs. Somewhere in here is the VLAN documentation on how to create a VLAN on top of that. So this is one way that you can do that. It becomes persistent. It is then controlled right throughout the normal OpenShift management processes. You can do effectively the exact same thing using CoreOS installer and the live ISO method. So boot to the ISO, it drops you into a command line prompt. You can use nmcli, and then with nmcli, configure the network however it needs to be configured, and then use the copy network. Here we go, the copy network option when you execute CoreOS installer. And that will take the currently configured network config in the live ISO or the live environment and copy it to the, sorry for bumping the microphone, copy it into the installed OS on the host. So that is with UPI, that is the suggested method of doing it. Right? With IPI, it's going to be a little bit different. In particular, and I'm going to pick on VMware again. So if we look at VMware with network customizations, actually, I don't want that. I want, where is it? Machine sets.
So Suresh points out, yeah, I wanted to evaluate the NM state operator, but I'm waiting on the OCP 4.7 release for Vsphere.
Yeah. Ouch.
Sorry, buddy.
Yeah.
We all are kind of, right?
So you can, so if you look at NM state, and if you saw the tab that I have here, you see this big red, it's in technology preview only. So if you deploy NM state or utilize NM state standalone, it is tech preview. If you use it with OpenShift virtualization, it is fully supported. So if you happen to be running on physical servers, if you have bare metal available, you can deploy the OpenShift virtualization operator. Even if you don't actually deploy any virtual machines, you'll get the NM state operator, and it'll be fully supported. And that goes back to 4.5, I believe.
Nice.
So yeah, you can use it there. So to complete out my other thought around IPI and networking. So if you're deploying, for example, with Vsphere IPI, you want to create a machine set that will have multiple network device definitions here. Right. So for each network that you need to connect to, you create a new network name device here. You add that in. When the machine set goes to deploy that node, it will ensure that each one of those is there. So the first device, presumably the one that is on the primary network that has DHCP enabled, remember IPI requires DHCP, it'll boot, it'll get its IP address, it'll be fine. The second device, you'll probably see some errors, right? It'll probably complain and then eventually take a link local IP address. That's fine. Might delay the boot process by a few seconds, that type of stuff. Once it's deployed, once it's joined to the cluster, then you can use what I would suggest is nm state. So this brings me to the third option that I don't really consider an option. So yes, it is technically possible to use machine config, right? You can go in, you can create a machine config. Let's see here. User provisions, deleting a machine. We'll find it eventually, even if I have to search for it. Somewhere in here, machine config pool, machine config. Yeah, we'll go with this one. So you can use a machine config, and you can use the machine config to push that. Yeah, here's an example of one. You can use that to push an ignition config that configures that network interface. The problem is now you have to have a machine config per node. Right? Because that node, right, each node has a different static IP address. And that machine config, you can't just say, you know, I have 10 nodes in my cluster that all need static IPs. I'm going to create 10 machine configs, and then I'm going to put them all in the same machine config pool, because that'll push out the same config to all machines in the pool. And well, they don't all have the same static IP address. So now you have to have 10 machine config pools, one for each one of the nodes in the cluster that inherits that chain, right? So it would be, for example, the worker and then the node specific, and then you end up with a machine config specific to that pool to configure the worker's static IP address. Technically possible, nothing wrong with that, absolutely fully supported, a management nightmare. And I mean,
to put it mildly,
in many different ways, because it bleeds over into things. Well, now I have a one node machine config pool. When we think about things like doing updates in a cluster, it does those updates on a machine, right? It learns things, or it inherits things like how many nodes can be down at a time from the machine config pool. Great. So when it needs to do something like apply updates, it says, well, machine config pool, how many nodes can be down at a time? Oh, only one? Okay, well, I will sequentially go through and reboot, apply updates and reboot the nodes one at a time. Or you could say maybe it's 25%. So in a pool with 10 nodes, I can take down up to 25% of them at any one time to apply updates or do whatever machine config needs to do. So now with a single node machine config pool, you effectively have to disable those. So now the cluster can get into this state where you're relying fully on things like pod disruption budget to control how many nodes can be down at any point in time. So it's definitely a management overhead issue, as well as introduces a lot of other kind of unforeseen risk that's inside of there. And that's just the one that comes to off the top of my head. So yes, it seems like machine config is a great option for applying static IP. It's really, really not. The other option, which you can kind of squint at and maybe be okay, would be to do something like write a bash script. I'll say bash, and have it be, so write a bash script that detects which node it's on, and then applies the static IP configuration that way. Right. So then you have one machine config for all of the nodes in the machine config pool, and that script just says, hey, I'm on node 12. I need to give it this IP address. I don't know how it should work, should be fine. assuming everything goes according to plan, right? Nothing goes haywire or anything like that. That is an option. So maybe consider that with the others. But again, it can, doing updates or changes, hey, I added a new node to the pool. I went from 12 nodes to 14 nodes. Well, now you have to recreate that script. When you recreate that script and update the machine config, it's going to trigger a reconfigure of all of the nodes in the machine config pool. So they'll all go through, get the new file, and then have to go through a reboot and all that other stuff. So still not a panacea, if you will. Do we have any questions, Chris? I haven't seen chat
there's
moving
none,
out of the corner of my eye. So
come in.
okay. So we've only got just a few minutes left, maybe 6 or 7 minutes left. So I want to make sure if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask those. Just as with last week, I've got, I don't know, 20 or 30 different links here that I'll put all of these into the blog post. Look for that on Monday morning. Or excuse me, Friday morning. So you can find all of the stuff that we would talk about. You can, of course, always reach out at any point in time, streaming or not, through social media. So on Twitter, I am Practical Andrew. So if you saw me chatting inside of the Twitch chat or any of the places where it gets rebroadcast, same username, Practical Andrew, all one word on Twitter. You can also reach out to me directly through Red Hat email, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. You can reach out anytime. Happy to field those questions, make the connections, and get those questions answered for you. So I think the other thing that I want to talk about here while we are, during the stream, while I have your attention, is something that has come up that is kind of floating in the back of my head as one of those top of mind things, but hasn't quite reached that point yet. But I think I am going to talk about it. And that is the concept of, and I'm combining a few things here, and that is, how do I do resource management inside of the cluster? And ultimately, and I think most of us probably know, clusters aren't static, especially if we're thinking like IPI and we're doing machine sets and auto scaling and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
The nodes are constantly changing. Yeah. But I also want to remind us that we can change the size of the nodes, for example, and we can balance the resources, so CPU, memory, storage, et cetera, according to what the applications are actually using. And additionally, the metric service gives us things like, well, the pods are making requests. Remember, request is effectively a reservation, but they're only using, maybe 10% of that. So working with our applications peers to basically say, hey, why are you requesting 10 gigabytes of RAM and, only using 1? That's 9 gigabytes of memory that I can't use for other applications in the cluster. And maybe their answer is, well, we do have a batch job that runs, twice a month that does require that much memory. Okay, well, let's see if we can find a better, a better way of meeting those needs. And while I know the OpenShift metric service has a lot of data, a lot of information in it, our partners, so partners like Datadog and Turbonomic and gosh, there's like 5.
There's so many.
On and on and on of, in all of these metrics, in the metric space, they take the same information, right? Sometimes they take it directly from metrics. Sometimes they collect their own, and they have tools inside of their portfolio to be able to automatically take action as well. I recently saw the Turbonomic folks give a demo where they were able to predictively move pods to free up resources for things that were happening. And it was pretty cool stuff. So definitely always be cognizant of, real resource utilization versus reserved resource utilization. How can I best optimize the cluster, to take advantage of those resources? If you're deploying in a hyperscaler, right, you're paying for those instances if they're deployed, whether or not you're actually using those resources. So making sure that you're actually pushing that CPU utilization to real usage of 80-90% is a cost saving measure. Instead of years ago, I remember having conversations around our virtualization deployment was only at like 30% utilization or something like that. And it's one of those, like, the higher you drive that utilization, the better value you get out of it, which is definitely true with the hyperscalers.
So we got a question. It's from Don Weeks. Are there instructions for installing open source Calico as the SDN in OpenShift? Can that only be done by UPI install?
So
the second part, I believe, is yes.
Yeah, so the SDN can only be deployed at install time.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if it's IPI or UPI or even non-integrated.
Mhm.
It'll absolutely work. And you can, if you haven't seen Calico's docs, you can look at their docs here about how to deploy inside of OpenShift. More or less, the principle is the same regardless of the installation method. So you see this create manifests, and then you drop all of their manifests into the correct place, and then continue with the rest of the install. They don't make any differentiation here as to whether it's IPI or UPI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool.
Yep. So how often do we need to update the rel core OVA file on VMware? So my suggestion would be at least once every major or Y release. So
4.2,
so when you go
4.4, yeah,
exactly. So 4.6 to 4.7, update the OVA. Within the same release, it will, and even with it between the major releases, so long as it's an earlier version, it should update CoreOS to the right version as a part of the installation process.
Right.
So essentially, it'll clone that OVA for the new worker node. It'll reach out to the control plane, to the machine config operator, and it'll say, give me my ignition. And part of that is, hey, pull down this new RPMOS tree image and switch over. So that should work. You might be able to slightly speed up the node provisioning, node joining process if you're on the same release that it wants. But yeah.
So question, those I have no idea on the answer to this one. Those manifests are for enterprise Calico, right? And I don't know.
I don't think so. This is the Project Calico website.
Yeah, I mean,
this isn't the Tigera website.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's talking about Tigera status, Tigera operator.
You see here's the Tigera operator.
OpenShift marketplace. I mean,
I have always assumed that this is the open source version. Yeah, not the enterprise version.
Not the case. That'd be interesting.
And I've deployed this a couple of times, so yeah, I would be interested.
Yeah, you haven't swiped your credit card to deploy it, have you?
Not that I'm aware of.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, Don, please feel free to reach out. And
yeah,
I'll also poke some of our Calico folks.
Poke. Yeah. Go ahead, you poke. And
so please feel free to reach out. Andrew.Sullivan at redhat.com. Yeah. Okay. So that's really all I think we've got time to get through today. As I said, I have a whole list of stuff that I will include in the blog post. We can talk about that during the next show as well. So which brings me to my next point, which is we won't be back for 3 weeks.
Right. There's stuff happening.
Yes. So next week is Red Hat Summit. If you aren't registered for Red Hat Summit, I definitely encourage you to do that. It's free.
It is free.
So yeah, absolutely register for Red Hat Summit. It is a 2-part event. So the first one is next week. The second part will be in June. You'll get all the announcements and alerts and emails and everything about both of those events. So definitely encourage you to do that. If you haven't already, the following week, so the first week of May, is KubeCon. So we will be off air. This show will be off air for both of those weeks.
Yes.
But Chris will definitely be on air doing tons and tons and tons of streaming with all the stuff that we got going on there.
A lot of office hours, a lot of interesting, fun things are going to be happening. So yeah, please tune in.
So we will be back. I believe it is May 12th. The currently scheduled topic will be Red Hat Enterprise Linux CoreOS, or as we lovingly know it, RCOS, with Mark Russell, who's the product manager for CoreOS. But yeah, we can absolutely bleed over some of these topics. Again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Social media, Practical Andrew at Twitter, or Andrew.Sullivan at redhat.com. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all. Have a good one. And coming up next, we'll be talking about 3 critical areas of container resource management with the folks at Densify. So please stay tuned. I'll be queuing that up now.